Clocks by Darrel Schweitzer. He returned to the house again on an evening in November. He had been away a year, but nothing had changed. The house stood pale and dark among the trees as the twilight deepened, as the grey walls, trees, ground and sky all faded into that particular autumn grey which is almost blue. He stood in the cold, listening to the rain hiss faintly on the fallen leaves, wishing he could stand there forever, that time would cease its motion, and this moment would never pass. But inevitably, as he did every year, he made his way along the leaf-covered path to the front porch. Again he stood, procrastinating, fumbling with his keys, until his fingers by themselves found the key he needed, and his hand had turned it in the lock before he was even aware. Then he stepped into the dark house, the door sweeping aside a year's worth of junk mail he had never been able to cancel. Behind him, the rain whispered, and when he closed the door, there was another sound, a faint ticking. He stooped to gather the junk mail into a basket, and noticed a clock on the mail stand, a few inches from his face. It was a cheap, plastic thing, decorated with figures of shepherd girls, like characters out of Heidi. It was one of his wife's clocks. As long as her clocks were here, she was too, in a way. All her life, Edith had collected clocks. He wound it, and it seemed to tick louder. Then he stood up and wound a row of little golden alarm clocks that stood along the top of a bookcase to his left. They had stopped, and now they added to the faint, rhythmical ticking. He didn't set the time on any of them. That wasn't the point. It was only after he had completed this task that he turned on the lights, surveyed the hallway, and stepped to his right into the living room. The ticking followed him until it was lost in the deeper sound of the grandfather clock that waited in the shadows by the fireplace. He remembered how they had found that grandfather clock in an antique shop once, long, long ago. How Edith had raved over it, begging him to buy it in her joking but earnest way, until he relented, even though they couldn't afford it. There had been weekends spent polishing, repairing, finishing. In the end, when they were ready, when the thing stood dark and gleaming in the living room, it had been like a birth, or that was how he remembered it now. He flicked on one small light and saw in the semi-darkness another clock humped on the mantelpiece. There was a story about that one too, and as he wound the clock once more, the memory came to him. Then he sat down by the empty fireplace, exhausted and sad. He put his feet up on a little stool and stared into the fireplace for a while, listening to the clocks. The house was stirring in the soft tick, tick, ticking, like the breathing of a great beast turning in its sleep. He dozed off, and when he awoke it was dark outside. He heard sounds from the kitchen, dishes touching gently, a cabinet door closing. But he remained where he was, listening to those sounds and to the clocks. The grandfather clock chimed softly. A few minutes later he did get up, his joints aching. He realized that he was still wearing his hat and coat. He left them on the chair and walked through a narrow hall, past the dark basement stairway into the kitchen. There was a steaming cup of tea on the counter by the sink, and 2 slices of warm toast on a plate, both buttered, one with jam, one without, the way she had always made them for him when he worked late at night. He turned and stretched to wind the clock on top of the spice cabinet. It was a smiling metal Buddha with a clock face in its belly, a ridiculous thing, again full of memories. But she had put it there once, long, long ago, and there it remained, gazing down at him serenely as he ate his toast and drank his tea. He was almost crying then, but he held back his tears as he went from room to room, winding the clocks until their sound was like that of 1,000,000 tiny birds outside the windows, gently, very patiently pecking to get in. Upstairs, a door closed. In the library he found a brush with long blonde hairs in it, discarded on a desktop. He used a key to wind an intricately carven wooden castle of a clock. The ticking was still gentle, but more insistent, unyielding, like the sound of surf on a quiet night. When he had made a circuit of the first floor, he came to the front door again, but turned away from it, and slowly climbed the front stairs. He was sobbing by then. The sounds from behind him seemed to rise, to propel him up the stairs. He found his wife's furry slippers at the top, by the bathroom door where she often kept them. He wept and leaned his head against the wall, pounding softly with his fist. More than anything else, he just wanted to leave. But then he heard the singing from behind the bedroom door, and he knew that of course he could not go away. The song was one he had taught Edith before they were married, long, long ago. He entered the bedroom, and she was there, and she was young and beautiful. She helped him undress and pulled him into the bed, whispering softly as she did, then silent, and for a while he was completely happy, suspended in a single moment of time. A clock ticked on the nightstand. When he awoke, it was morning, and she was gone. The empty half of the bed was cold, the covers drawn back. He wept again, bitterly, deeply, cursing himself for having continued the cruel, miraculous farce, for torturing himself one more time, for doing this somehow to her once again. He held up his hands before his face, and he saw how wrinkled the backs of them were, how age-spotted. He touched the top of his head, running his fingers through his thinning hair. She had been 26 and beautiful. She would always be 26 and beautiful. And the memories came flooding back with horrible vividness until he was living them again. The rainy night, the screeching tires, the car on its side by the road's edge, Edith in his arms, while one set of headlights after another flared by and nobody stopped for what seemed like hours. He turned over in the bed and pressed his face into the pillow, crying like a small child and hoping absurdly that he would eventually run out of tears. He tried to tell himself that he wouldn't come again next year, that this would finally cease. But he knew better. When he got up to dress and found a note stuck onto the telephone by the bed, it was only a confirmation. The note said, "I love you, Edith." He was still crying, but softly, as he went down the front stairs, around and into the kitchen, and from there down the dark, creaking stairway into the basement. At the bottom, He stood there once more, wishing he could stand there motionless forever, that he didn't have to go forward, but again he knew better. He flicked on the lights, revealing the thousands upon thousands of clocks that filled the basement, crowded on shelves, standing against walls and spread across the floor, and holding in their midst, by a fantastic spiderweb of wires, a closed coffin that seemed to float a few inches above the rug. It was as if the clocks had grown there, proliferating. He had long since given up wondering if there were more of them now than there had once been. His mind could supply no explanation, but he knew that somehow, if even one clock in the whole house remained running, and somehow, in defiance of all reason, one or more would always keep running for a whole year, awaiting his return on this night in November, time would stop, or perhaps slide backwards, and Edith would be as she had been on the night before her death, loving him, never aware of any future, forever young while he continued to age. He didn't know if it was real or not. There no longer seemed to be such things as real and unreal, but he could never bring himself to put an end to it, and he wept as he made his way gingerly among the clocks, winding each one. Their voices grew louder and louder, resonating in the cramped basement, while he wept and trembled and worked with furious, desperate care, and in the end the sound of them was like screaming.